Welcome back, friends. The previous weekend's storm results are in, and I got all the data here for you. So sit back, relax, and let's get to it. Before we get started, we'll do the old YouTube pleasantries. If you liked the video, don't forget to hit the like button. It really helps push it out there for more people to see. If you really liked it, don't forget to subscribe to make sure you get all my latest videos. If you're looking for any other ways to help support the channel, I have a Patreon, patreon.com/warpfriends. Link is in the description below. Alright guys, let's get started. First up is the player numbers from the previous week. So last week we had 861 players, bringing the Dataslate total to just under 4,300. Games played last week was 2,418, and bringing the Dataslate total to just under 22,000. And we had 18 tournaments, bringing the total for the Dataslate up to 83. All right, and first up is the win percentage by armies for the previous week. So just a quick reminder, Games Workshop acceptable win rate is 45 to 55%, so anything that falls within that range will be in green. Anything 5% above or below will be in orange, and anything above that or below that will be in red. So coming in last week at number 1 was Genestealer Cults with 62.7%. Number 2 is Imperial Knights at 57.3%, Drukhari at 56.5%, Chaos Knights at 55.7%, and then Sisters of Battle at 54.3%. Down at the bottom in last place, we had AdMech at 36.1%. Chaos Space Marines at 37.5%. Then we had Agents and Grey Knights both at 40%, and then Chaos Demons at 41.4%. So the arrows here, they show the changes versus the previous week, so you can get an idea how an army is moving up and down week over week. So coming in number 1 with Genestealers, 62.7% is a crazy high number, and that's dwarfing even Imperial Knights, who had a 57%, which is also really high. So Genestealers had a really good week last week, a lot of good results. Drukhari also had a really good week, 56.5%. They're kind of up and down each week based on, who's kind of playing them. And Imperial Knights also, as usual, 57%, also had a really good week. Sisters is doing consistently better, actually pushing up towards 55%. So starting to get some legs under them and perform a little bit better. I had a good bounce back week for Death Watch at 51%. I think they were down last week. Same as Emperor's Children. They're back up to 50% this week, which is good to see. And then some of the ones that fell down a little bit, Leagues of Votann, 48%. Thousand Suns at 48 as well. They both had pretty good weeks last week, but they're down below 50% this week, but still within a good range right in the middle there. Tyranids 46%. There's a little bit drop off there for the next spot down. They've been struggling a little bit lately. So while they did have a little bit of a better week last week, overall they haven't been doing the best, and this week is just another one of those weeks for them, unfortunately. So one of the ones that down the bottom we haven't seen in a while, Chaos Demons down at 41.4%. They haven't really been near the bottom since, I guess, Christmas with Grotmus, the Legion of Excess. The last 6 months, they've been either in the middle or up near the top. So this is one of the few weeks they've dropped down to the bottom. We'll see how they bounce back or see how it shapes up going forward. But they have been having a little bit of a steady decline down towards the middle. So there's nothing wrong with that. As long as they can sort of balance out in the middle, everything should be all good. And same as Chaos Space Marines, they've been struggling a little bit lately. Now, this week was really bad at 37.5%. So they had some really poor results this week. I don't expect it to maintain that low going forward. Overall, it was a pretty imbalanced week, as it has been lately. The orange is growing bigger and bigger each week, and the green keeps shrinking, which is not what you want to see. The more green, the better, and we're getting more and more orange stacked up at the top. And if you've been following my channel for a while now, you can go back and some of these previous charts, there's very little orange at all, especially at the top. So this last data slate kind of really broke things with the way they sort of balanced Knights and Death Guard, and it's kind of playing out how everyone sort of expected, where the top is doing really well, and it's kind of the most imbalanced it's been in a long time. So I don't know if an emergency patch is needed, emergency data slate, but something needs to be done. Otherwise, it's going to be a pretty rough, next 6 or so weeks or eight or so weeks until we get another data slate. So hopefully people figure it out and it gets a little more even, but I have a feeling it's going to be a little out of balance for the next few weeks. All right, moving on is the army representation. So this is the percentage of players who play each army. So an average representation is around 3.6, 3.7%. So anything above that obviously means more players than the average should be playing it, and anything less is less. So Death Guard coming in number 1 last week at 9.9% of the meta. Imperial Knights at 7%, Aeldari at 6.6%, Tyranids at 5.6%, and then Chaos Knights at 5.3%. And then down at the bottom we have Agents at 0.1, AdMech at 0.8, Death Watch at 0.8, Templars at 1, and Genestealer Cults at 1.2. So Death Guard somehow just keeps going up every week. It seems like they're going to reach their maximum limit, but this week is even higher, 9.9%. They're so close to tipping over that 10%, which is crazy for a 26 army game, and one army is taking up 10% of the meta. That's definitely a huge problem. And even more Knights is at 7% is a massive problem all on its own, but it just looks normal compared to Death Guard. Aeldari had a big jump in players this week. They've been kind of up and down. You know, they've maintained pretty high up, but they've fallen off a little bit since the nerfs, but they had a really big week at 6%. Tyranids, despite their sort of poor results lately, they still have a lot of players at 5.6%. Chaos Knights, not surprising, 5.3%. New Codex is pretty good, same as Thousand Suns at 5.2. All these well-performing armies are up pretty high, and then you just have the popular ones that are always up there, like Tyranids and Custodes and Necrons. Down at the bottom there, Sisters still at 2%, despite their good results. You know, I don't expect them to get up over Emperor's Children. I think that's kind of where they're going to live. Around 2.5 to 3.5%, depending on the week. And then we have all these armies down at the bottom that are just below 1.5%. Grey Knights, Space Wolves, Gene Stealers, Templars, Deathwatch, and Admech. They're always down there. Space Wolves I expect to jump up a little bit with the Codex coming out. Grey Knights, eventually when they get their Codex, the same thing, the same as Templars, maybe a little bit. Templars is not as popular army overall as those two, but I think the bottom is going to look like the bottom and the top is going to look like the top, and it's just indicative of the win rates. Everything is just really unbalanced right now, unfortunately. All right, now we're moving on to the combined stats for the previous week. So this is Armies win rates, XOX1 percentage, and representation. So just a quick reminder, XOX1 percentage is the percentage of players who went 5-0 or 4-1 at a tournament. It's not a perfect stat, but it's just a good way to see how an army is performing. You combine that with their win rate, and you can see how they're doing at a tournament. You know, if they have a high XOX1, they're more likely to be at those top tables and have a higher chance of winning a tournament. And if you have a really low XOX1, you have a lot of people performing poorly and not really getting those chances to win the tournament. Coming in number 1 for the combined stats, we have Drukhari, and then number 2 is Deathwatch, then Gene Stealer Cults, Imperial Knights, and then Chaos Knights. And then down at the bottom, we have Admech, Agents, Chaos Space Marines, Grey Knights, and Black Templars. Let's just start at the bottom here quickly. It's what you would expect. It's basically a mirror of the representation and the win rates. All the ones that you would expect to see down at the bottom are down at the bottom. Their XOX1, pretty indicative of their win percentage. Most of them are 40% or below, so there's a good chance that not many people actually had a lot of success at a tournament. And Grey Knights had 8% of their players go 5-0 or 4-1, and Chaos Space Marines only had 7.7, so that's only 1 or 2 players per army. So, you know, so basically all those armies at the bottom just were living at the bottom tables and just kind of had poor results and poor showings at pretty much every tournament. Looking at the top of the chart, we actually see a little bit of a surprising outcome here. The top 3 armies are ones that you kind of wouldn't expect. You have Drukhari, Deathwatch, and Gene Stealers. Well, they all have pretty good win rates. Deathwatch is only 51. The other ones are at least 56 and up. They all have insanely good XOX1 percentages and very low representation, the highest being 2%. So Drukhari has 41% XOX1, Deathwatch has 43%, and Gene Stealers has 30, which is very, very high considering the average is around 15 to 17%. And then when you look at it compared to like Knights and Chaos Knights, who are overperforming well above all averages across the board, they're only in the mid-20s. So that just tells you how good the Gene Stealer, Deathwatch, and Drukhari players did last week. So it's kind of a tale of 2 different playstyles here. You have Imperial Knights, Chaos Knights, and Thousand Suns armies like that, where they have a really high representation and really good statistics, like including Death Guard in there. Those are armies that are like overpowered. So you have all kinds of players playing them, and despite all those players, they're still getting tons of good results. So even those inexperienced or newer players or people who are just picking them up are still finding ways to do good and not dragging those stats down. So those armies are kind of broken, and everyone knows they're kind of broken, but that just reinforces it. Then you have armies like Drukhari, Deathwatch, and Gene Stealers who have 2% of the representation or less, and they have really good win rates and really good XOX1 percentages. So extremely high percentage of the players doing really well. So this is an indication of a faction who has very good players, knows how to do good with them, and they all showed up for these factions this week. So as the example everyone knows, Drukhari, you have Skari as a faction expert, and I'm sure there's Deathwatch and Gene Stealer experts out there who are bumping those numbers up. So you look at Deathwatch, 50% win rate, but a 43% XOX1. So half their players went undefeated or lost 1 game, and basically the other half didn't win any games or only won 1 game, and it kind of balances out. So you have a lot of players doing really well. The rest of the faction is struggling. So there's a lot of play in those factions if you know how to use them, but only a select few people can really get the most out of them right now. One of the more overperformers also in the middle there is Tau. They're at 44% win rate, but they have a 26% XOX1 and a 3.5% rep. So this is another indication of a faction who on the whole is struggling, but there are players, there's a small section of the player base who knows how to handle it and are doing really well with them. Despite the large grouping of players who only lost 1 game or didn't lose any games, they're still below 45% win rate, so that means pretty much everyone else struggled really bad with them. So it's probably an army that's not overpowered. Otherwise, that XOX1 on top of a good army would bring their win rate up to like 55%, but now they're sitting at 44. So there's a few players there who know what they're doing, and the rest, everyone else is kind of struggling a little bit. And everything else is kind of looking how you expect it. Normally this chart's a little bit more balanced. The middle like 18 armies are usually closer together, but it's week over week, it's getting more and more top heavy. And I mean, this week is a bit of an outlier with so many of the smaller armies doing so well that it's just skewing those like numbers at the top way up high. Looks the same as every other chart. So the top is doing all the work. The top 5 armies are just running the show, and the bottom like 10 are just, just lucky to be there. All right, moving on is the tournament wins for each army last week. So Chaos Knights and Imperial Knights both had 3 wins. Thousand Sons, Death Guard, and Blood Angels both had 2. Then we had Tau, Space Marines, Orcs, Necrons, Genestealer Cults, and Custodes all with 1. Not surprisingly, Knights as a whole, with 6 tournament wins between the 2 Knight armies. Based on the stats, that makes sense. Thousand Sons and Death Guard, also 2 of the armies that are up near the top of all the combined stats and win rates and everything. Not surprising to see them, same as Blood Angels. Tau, while they did have a very poor win rate, they had a really high XOX1. So one of those players managed to pull out the win who had a really high XOX1. And then everyone else after that just picked up some random tournament wins. Next up is the tournament wins for each sub-faction. So this kind of just breaks down how the armies got their wins, so we can just get a better idea of what detachments and sub-factions are doing all the work. So at the top there, Noble Lance, obviously for Imperial Knights, got all 3 wins. For Blood Angels, Liberator Salt Group, and for Thousand Sons, it was Grand Coven. Chaos Knights was split between 3 different armies there. We had Trader's Lance, we had Lords of Dread, and we had Infernal Lance. And surprisingly, with Orcs, it was Cult of Speed who ended up picking up the win. So that's kind of fun to see. A little bit of a detachment out of nowhere getting the win. So it's always a nice little change of pace. And then for Death Guard, we had Mortaine's Hammer and Virulent Victorium. All right, moving on, we're looking at the win percentage by armies for the current data slate. So this is the last 5 weeks of results. So looking at the top there, we have Imperial Knights at 56.4%. Death Guard at 53.8, Thousand Sons at 53.1, Leagues of Votan at 52.5, and then Chaos Knights at 51.7. And then down at the bottom, we have Agents at 20%, Orcs at 42, Death Watch at 42.3, Dark Angels at 43.4, and then AdMech at 43.9, rounding out the bottom 5. Not surprisingly, Knights are still at the top at 56.4%. They had about that win percentage this week, and they're maintaining a pretty healthy lead over Death Guard and Thousand Sons, who on their own have a pretty good win rate, well above the average. Chaos Knights jumped up a couple spots there. They're into the top 5 now after another good week of results. I expect to see them creep up a little bit. They'll probably overtake Votan. I don't know if they'll end up catching Thousand Sons, depending on how they do in the next couple weeks. Genestealer Cults and Sisters, both in 6 and 7 there. Both at around 51 to 51.5%. Really good to see. Those armies have been struggling for a little bit, so it's nice to see them back up there. Tyranids are close to falling below that 45% threshold. I mentioned they were struggling a little bit. They've had some rough weeks, down at 45.2%. So it's a bit of a rough go. The new detachment didn't save them, but people are enjoying it by the looks of it. It looks like a fun detachment, but it's not very competitive, or at least it's not the one that's pulling the weight like some other armies have. And Orcs are essentially at the bottom there if we exclude Agents, who only had 1 player this week. Orcs at 42%. It's a bit of a fall from grace for them. The last couple data slates, they've been up near the top, but after the big nerfs they received, they're down at the bottom, and I have a feeling until the next data slate, they're going to bring around the bottom 1 or 2 there. Games Workshop tends to go all or nothing with Orcs this edition. They're either like the best army or they're just horrible. So they haven't found that good, comfortable middle ground yet. So hopefully they can find a little balance there and revert maybe some of the changes they made that were a little too drastic and sort of bring them back up into the average. Overall, this chart's looking a lot better than the weekly chart is. We only got 1 army above 55% for the data slate, so that is good to see. And we have a couple armies that are creeping up into the 45% range. Looking at Black Templars and Space Marines, they're at 44.5 and up. So if we can get them up to the top, we can just have a couple armies sort of above that acceptable win rate, and it'll look a lot better. But the armies at the top are still much higher than they normally are. Normally, the one leading the pack is at 52, 53%. We don't normally have 3 or 4 armies up above that threshold. But looking at this chart, it's not surprising to see how sort of skewed it is a little bit between the top and the bottom based off the weekly results we see every week. Next up is the Army representation for the current data slate. So again, the last 5 weeks of data for the Army representation. So Army representation is the percentage of players who play each army. So if everyone played every army equally, they would be about 3.6, 3.7%. Let's just get an idea of where everyone should be. So at the top, we had Death Guard so far at 8.8%, Knights at 6.3%, Tyranids at 5.8%, Necrons at 5.3%, and then World Eaters and Space Marines at 5.1%. And down at the bottom, we have Agents at 0.2%, Templars at 0.9%, Deathwatch at 0.9%, and then we have Space Wolves, AdMech, and Gene Stealers all around 1.5%. So Death Guard showing no signs of slowing down, almost 9% representation over 5 weeks, which is just an insane amount. Even Knights at 6.3 is way too high, and they're in second place by a long shot. Tyranid is still in third place, 5.8%. Despite their poor results, people love that army, and people keep playing them even if they're not that great or just average. So, not surprising to see them there. Same as Necrons, they're always a popular army. World Eaters up there, 5.1, is a little bit surprising. They did get their codex, and it's okay. It's not broken like Death Guard or anything like that, but it's a serviceable, good army that is just performing at the average, but they have a very popular army, so they've got a lot of players. And then down at the bottom there, I don't know if 1 week of results next week is going to help Space Wolves out, but we should see them climb up a little bit now that their codex is released, and we'll get some people actually piling in and getting to play them after a full week of getting the codex there. So hopefully we'll see Space Wolves jump up a little bit. We can pull some of the players from those top armies, hopefully not the ones at the bottom, and kind of balance this out a little bit more. There is some armies down at the bottom who still don't have a codex, and it could help balance things out once they get theirs, like Grey Knights, Drukhari, Space Wolves, Black Templars, and Leagues of Votann. If they all got their codex, we might see some players from the top come down and fill them in, but that's only if those armies actually do get some sort of nerf to sort of bring them back in line. All right, now we have the combined stats for the current data slate. So Armies win rates, XOX1 percentage, and representation. So at the top there, we have Imperial Knights, and then we have Death Guard, Thousand Sons, Blood Angels, and then Sisters of Battle. And then down at the bottom, we have Agents, Black Templars, AdMech, Orcs, and Grey Knights. So Imperial Knights and Death Guard sitting comfortably at the top, and by comfortably I mean really comfortably at the top. Even Knights is way above Death Guard, but they're both very far above Thousand Sons, and they can thank that mostly to their representation, kind of making up some of the difference there. Drukhari is just a hair under 20% XOX1 for the data slate, so that's actually really impressive considering the average is around 15 to 17%. It is carrying their numbers right now. Their win percentage is right about average, 48.8%, but that almost 20% XOX1 is bumping them up into the middle, like upper middle there. So, that's masking some of their representation issues they're having, putting them right in line with their brothers there, Aeldari. The armies at the bottom, they continue to suffer in the current meta. It's not surprising. A lot of these armies, I feel like they have a lot of poor anti-tank. I know Grey Knights don't have a lot of high-strength weapons. Orcs don't really have a ton of high-strength stuff. They did get, tank busts and stuff, but overall, there's not a ton of anti-tank stuff in those armies. Same as AdMech and Black Templars. And if you're going into a very tough current meta like Knights, Death Guard, Thousand Sons, high toughness, a lot of minuses to wound and all that stuff, you're going to suffer for it. And those armies at the bottom are not surprising to me, at least. I feel like they're kind of behind the 8 ball when they've played those armies to begin with, and they're also in a bad spot anyway, so it's like a double-edged sword here, and they're just getting chopped down every which way they go. Well, this chart does look better than this week's version of it. It's still pretty heavily skewed towards the top, and at least we have a decent chunk in the middle there that's pulling out a good, consistent average, but it's not surprising to see. It is what it is, and it's kind of look this way for the next foreseeable future, I have a feeling. All right, next up is the Army Tournament wins, and this is all the tournament wins for the last 5 weeks of the data slate, and it's broken down week over week, so each color represents a different week, so you can get an idea of when each army won their tournaments. So at the top there, we have Death Guard at 16, we have Imperial Knights at number 2 at 11, then we have Chaos Knights at 6, World Eaters at 5, and then we have 3 armies at 4 with Aeldari, Gene Stealers, and Thousand Sons. We still have 4 armies without wins. We have Deathwatch, Drukhari, Agents, and Space Wolves. And then we have a smattering of armies at 1, 2, and 3 wins. So Knights is actually starting to catch up to Death Guard a little bit. So you can see Death Guard won a whole bunch of tournaments in the first couple weeks there, and they've kind of slowed down a little bit, whereas Knights have sort of picked up the pace. So interesting to see if Knights will be able to catch them or pass them. Death Guard did have a pretty sizable lead. And even Chaos Knights is starting to pull out a few more wins, and they're creeping up into 3rd place there. So it's definitely like a big boy meta right now. The Knights, Death Guards, a lot of tough armies up at the top there, and it's showing with the tournament wins. And if you actually combine the top 4 armies, World Eaters, both Knight armies, and Death Guard, it's 45% of all tournament wins. So basically half of all tournament wins are coming from 4 armies, which is very poor balance, and you'd like to see a lot more of that spread out. It usually looks this way every data slate, but it's not usually this bad. It was this bad when orcs had more daga, but that was quickly nerfed and other armies were able to catch them. I have a feeling as the weeks go on, Imperial Knights and Death Guards leads are just going to keep increasing and increasing. All right, and the first faction focus this week is Emperor's Children. So, the newest army on the block, we haven't taken a look at them in a little bit, so it's a good time to check in and see how they're doing. So looking at their previous 8-week results, we can see their representation is anywhere from 2.5 to 5%. Over the last 5 weeks they've kind of settled in around 2.5 to 3%. And the win rate is anywhere from 46 to 51%, which is perfectly reasonable and actually not too bad. And if you look at their stats versus the meta average, they're pretty much just below average on everything. Gives their meta health rating a 90 out of 100. So, you look at that and say, okay, they're just performing a little bit below average. Overall, it's in a really good place. It's not how you want a new army to come in. Everyone wants to be Death Guard, everyone wants to be Chaos Knights and everything like that, where they're really good. But if every army came in and performed sort of like these guys and World Eaters and stuff right in the middle of the meta, it would be a lot healthier for the game. Looking at the sub-faction player numbers here, Coterie the Conceited has 77% of all players. So clearly there's just one detachment everyone's bringing. Peerless Bladesman has 15% and everyone else is under like 6. Looking at the sub-faction win percentages, Coterie actually has a 49.9% win rate. So it actually does have the highest win percentage, which makes sense as it has the most players. Their overall win percentage, I feel like, gets dragged down just a little bit because of Peerless Bladesman's win percentage is only 40%. Now they only have 15% of the player base, but that's enough to sort of drag it down just under the average. If that was up a little higher, I think they'd be pretty much bang on. But overall for Emperor's Children, I think they're in a pretty good spot. You'd like to see a little bit more play from the detachments. You don't want to see one detachment having over 75% of all the players. But looking at the win percentages, most of them are at least 45%. So, overall not too bad. So a little bit of internal balance between the detachments. I think they'd be in a little bit better spot. But overall, I think Emperor's Children is actually kind of settling into the meta quite nicely. And for a new army, you never know how that's going to kind of shape out. They could be really busted. They're usually not terrible, but it's nice to see them just performing, right around the average rate where they should be. And their one tournament win this data slate so far has come from Coterie the Conceited. All right, and the next faction focus is Aeldari. So this is an army that's kind of been up and down this entire edition. They've either been busted or just meh and then busted again. So that was a good time to take a look and see how they're doing. So over the last 8 weeks, we can see the representation fluctuates pretty high, anywhere from 7% down to 3.5%. But they never really drop down below the average. They are a very popular army, and they're almost always well above the average when it comes to representation. The win percentage, anywhere from 45 to 55%, which is kind of swingy some weeks over week, but generally speaking, they're right around 50% win rate, so that's also really good to see. So they had a lot of changes last data slate, and I wasn't quite sure how they were going to adjust in the new meta, but they've adjusted pretty good. And if you look at their army stats versus the meta average, you can kind of see that there. Their win rate is almost exactly bang on the average. Their army rep is above average. It almost always is. XOX1 is 18 versus 17, so just 1% above the average. And they've got 4 tournament wins versus 3 for the average. So if you look at their meta health rating, it's 108. So while it is very close to the average across the board, it's kind of like just a little bit on the opposite side of Emperor's Children, where they were like 90. These guys are about 110. So they're both within 10% of the middle, just on a little bit opposite ends, but both in very healthy spots. Looking at the sub-faction player count there, Aspect Host, 40% of the players, so it's the most popular detachment right now. Warhost has 22%, and then Seer Council has 14%. And if you look at the win percentages for each sub-faction down there, well, Aspect Host had the most players. They only have a 48.5% win rate, so respectable. It's good. So then you look down at Warhost. Well, they had the second most popular sub-faction. They actually had a much better results so far than Aspect Host with almost 54% win rate. So getting a lot of good play at a Warhost. And Seer Council down there has a 45% win rate. So while it is the third most popular sub-faction, it's kind of the worst of the major 3. And then every other detachment is right around 50%, except for Guardian, who's up almost to 70, but they only had like 2% of the players. So there's only 1 or 2 players that just had good results with them. Looking at the sub-faction tournament wins, Aspect Host has 2, Warhost has 1, and the Guardian Battle Host has 1. So despite their extremely low numbers for Guardian, they actually did pull out a win. I think overall that Aeldari's in a pretty good spot. People were kind of nervous that they were just going to gut the army when they made all those nerfs in the last data slate, but they've held up pretty good, and they're performing right around the average. And if, like, again, with Emperor's Children, if every army was doing this, this would be a great game instead of having, 2 or 3 armies just stomping everybody. Now, Aeldari has been those armies stomping everybody for a large part of this edition, but they've settled into the middle of the meta, and it's in a good spot. All right, and that wraps up this week, guys. Thanks for watching. Big shout out to my Patreon subscribers, Meep the Great, and my latest one, John Gurman. If you guys want to join them and help support the channel, you can check out the link in the description below, and any help is greatly appreciated. All right, guys, good luck in the tournaments coming up this weekend, and we'll see you next week.